Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest People Agenda podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And today we have a continuation of our spin-off series. It's the Frasier to Cheers. What is a CPO? And there'll be people who might be in their 20s and 30s that are currently thinking, what on earth is he talking about? I will let you Google Frasier and Cheers itself. But to kick off today's podcast, I always have my lovely co-host with me, the genius behind this idea, Debbie Mitchell. How are you doing? You all right?
I'm doing well, thank you. I'm very flattered at being called a genius. It's made my day, frankly.
You are a genius.
Thank
you are a genius for coming up with the idea, but I'll take the credit for bringing in our guest for today. And our guest is Chief People Officer of an organization called Ultimate Performance. His name is Keniro Miller. Keniro, how are you doing? You all right?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thank you. Good to be here.
It's really good to have you here, and I'm quite excited to get your perspective on our overarching sort of spin-off. What is a CPO? That's the meta question, but we can delve down into some of the specifics on it. And we haven't actually had somebody, a CPO, on from the industry that you work in. So I think what might be a really good sort of thing to kick us off with is a little bit about yourself, a little bit about the business, Ultimate Performance as well. And then also, you and I were having a little bit of an exchange on LinkedIn because you guys have got some exciting news about an awards finalist that you're up for. So maybe tease the listeners of the pod with a little bit of background on that.
I'm Keniro, obviously, and I've been in HR for, I think, just nearly 25 years now. Nearly as scary as having to remind people what Cheers was. So I've been working in HR for 25 years through many different sectors, primarily always within luxury retail, hospitality, leisure and tourism kind of sectors. So ranging from brands from TUI, the global tour operator, through to Soho House, Private Members Club, to Sodexo, very large global organization. And then finally, Cartier, to where I was just previously, to where I am now at Ultimate Performance. So generally always working within a client-facing environment is pretty much where most of my career has been focused on. Where my career brings me up to right now is at Ultimate Performance, which essentially is the global benchmark in strength training. That's how we tend to describe it to people. So it's been around since 2009. It was a founder-led business, which then was acquired by a private equity firm, Inflection, in April of 2024, which is when I came in and the rest of the exec suite came in at that time. So we have studios from Sydney to Los Angeles. So it's a private training environment. You can't just go in and train on your own in the gym and hope you get the results. It's very much curated. So it is curated under what we call the UP method. So it's not just the physical training aspect. Obviously, that's a very crucial and important part of the training. But how you deliver that is through precision, laser focused training. So you're one-on-one with your trainer. It's precise that you could be doing one particular exercise and your trainer will slightly move your wrist out a centimeter or your knee if you're not quite in the right shape. So you can't skip a rep. You can't do it by half. Everything's done 100%. And it's all done under an ecosystem of coaching, accountability, nutrition, health, wellness, etc. So there's a big ecosystem that kind of drives these results, which we're renowned for. And one thing, and the reason why I bring up the coaching and accountability with the clients, because the PTs or the trainers hold clients hugely accountable to ensure that the client gets the results that they want. And so on the flip side, we also internally then have that same approach with our trainers. We hold them accountable for the delivery of their performance. And that's where I came up to your point with designing what we call the PT check-in, which essentially is a proactive performance management tool. That's a digital online tool where the trainer will have a monthly meeting with their GM, and the check-in has 7 different KPIs around there, which are pretty much linked to overall performance. So that's the quality of the training, client frequency of training, retention of the client, average sessions, etc. So it covers everything from commercial, quality, and retention outputs from a client perspective. And then we balance that. We provide a score over a 3-month period, and they're either on plan, they're off plan, which means they're not doing quite so well, or they're flexing it, which means they're going above and beyond. And it's those metrics, then the same coaching method that we apply to the trainer that the trainer applies to the client. So it's this kind of a complete mirror image of how we operate. And that's where I got the idea to design this performance management tool. Just one, so that the audience that is using it is not seeing it as a traditional performance management tool, like a traditional PIP, where, it feels a bit teacher and pupil. This is much more about setting you up for success, thinking ahead, thinking about how you're preparing for the next month. What are you missing? What do you need support on? Where do you need that coaching? And so it's much more a positive and successful approach to a performance management tool rather than a reactive, okay, what didn't go well? How do we fix it? It's foreseeing that. And then it's holding you accountable and saying, hey, Keniro, you told me last month you're going to hit result X with this client. What you just missed, what happened? And then you talk through it. And then often the benefit of that journey is reviewing that and learning through those challenges that you had and then applying it for the next month. And then we celebrate the wins as well. So it's not just within that meeting. So if there's big wins from a particular trainer or someone's hit a particular milestone, then we obviously celebrate that outside of that as well. And then we use those particular trainers to coach other trainers on how they achieve certain success. So it's a great system for us. And again, mirrored to exactly what we would expect of the clients.
Thank you. All this talk of fitness, I've just pushed my bag of chocolate buttons slightly to the left. I find it really interesting, Keniro. And what I love about that story, that the framework that you've set up, is the strength of alignment between what I do every day and how I'm measured on that stuff I do every day. And I think so often we see with kind of performance management systems, it's I do my day job and then I've got to fill out a form that asks lots of questions that don't feel terribly relevant to me, but I'll fill them out just to try and demonstrate that I'm doing a good job. But there's a real strong alignment between those two things, the performance approach and the work I have to do. And that's where you've been nominated for your award, right? That initiative.
Yeah, exactly. So we've been nominated by the British HR Awards for Innovation of the Year, exactly aligned to that. So one, we designed and implemented it all in-house. So all the data that pulls through is all done in-house. So we have a great data team. A great thing about working at Ultimate Performance is that we have so much data to our hands because, again, it's a direct reflection of what the client expects of us or we expect of the client. So from a client perspective, we're renowned for data in that we don't just tell you we're going to get results. We can prove data-driven results internally and externally. Obviously, you can see the physical aspect in the change, but we can show data in terms of metrics, et cetera, of how you've transformed on that journey. So we hold a lot of data, and so it's just replicating that internal as well. So in terms of building the PT check-in, all those 7 KPIs, we had to pull all that data over all our employee group all over the world and then manipulate that into this PT check-in. And then we built the app internally as well. So it was all done and designed in-house. We didn't externalize any of it. And again, I think that part of the alignment of it's their job and it's relevant and it mirrors what they're doing rather than a reflection of something that's past was something that was recognized as well, for sure.
Yeah, and again, we talked about this on pods before. I think the kind of connectivity between the employee experience and the customer experience and how closely aligned they are. And it's a great example of how those two things pull together. So thank you for sharing that. I think what would be interesting is just to pull up a couple of levels and just go to the kind of, as Chris describes it, I think the meta question, which is, what is a chief people officer? So in your context, in your environment, I know you've been in bigger organizations before, now in a very different kind of context. Tell us what you think a chief people officer is, does, should be.
I think for me, a chief people officer is a hybrid role of pretty much most of the exec roles that you see sitting at an exec table. So I'm expected to have an opinion and contribute and challenge in finance. I'm expected to challenge in operations and have an opinion and find resolutions to issues in operations. Same with every other role that you can think of that sits there, technology, marketing. There's not one aspect where I'm not asked my opinion, and not just ask my opinion, hey, we just want to know what Keniro knows. I'm expected to contribute and help find a resolution or find an alternative. So therefore, you have to have a level of knowledge and exposure in all these different areas in order to make an informed opinion. You can't just continually come from a blinkered position of a CPO. It just wouldn't work. I cannot come in with a resolution that's just purely people focused, because it'll come with red tape. It won't think about 6 other pressing matters within that particular issue. So it's really about, for me, being a strange hybrid model of everyone that sits around that table, and yet having the authority to be able to sit behind that advice that you're giving. I think more and more now, and look, I've actually only been a chief people officer for a couple of years now, but even when I was VP or global director, you still have that accountability and you still have that exposure at that level. And I think more so since being at Soho House was when I was really exposed to it, which is having to be commercial. Like, where's your return? You can't have your return on saying, oh, I think people are happy. I think culture is okay. Like, where's the data to back that up? What is the culture? How do you translate the culture into data or into real tangible outputs? How do you translate people initiative to understand how it hits the bottom line and how it's going to impact that or not impact it? And I think for me, that's where it comes in terms of being more commercial, certainly really hybrid, and basically having to know pretty much most of those elements that all sit around that table.
So we've had just one of our other CPOs on this podcast talks about, I'm a leader of the enterprise. I'm not just a leader of the function. So it's that having that.
It's a good way of putting it, for sure.
But the other thing that's interesting is that some of the research that we did at the back end of last year, we published a paper, Implemented to Influencer. And some of what that talked about really resonates with what you're describing there, because it talks about how the CPO really needs to be able to describe tangibly what the outcomes are of whatever their work is or whatever their contribution is to, in this case, we were talking about transformation. So what is that real business impact? And to your point, not the what we typically call the softer or fluffy stuff, right? But real tangible, give me the ROI. Where's it making a difference? What does the data suggest? And the need for HR functions to do that more and more, to be able to have more credibility, I think, in those kind of transformations. We know lots of CPOs who do it brilliantly, by the way, but that's sometimes what's seen by C-suite as some of the gap.
I can easily sit here and tell you where I've contributed or helped drive 0.5 billion of revenue in a certain business, or where I've hit bottom commercial impact through protecting margin, or even when we talk about the PT check-in, it's a triple threat. It's not just, it just doesn't affect people in terms of performance management and that whole piece, but then also there's a commercial element of that, in that it's linked to promotions, which then helps manage the margin for our product. And then you've got obviously the client experience that comes out of that. So that's 3 areas out of a quadrant of 4 that the one initiative impacts. You have clear, tangible outputs on that and results from it as well, importantly.
This is fascinating. And I think what I really loved about talking about the PT stuff is we spend a lot of time talking about how HR people teams need to link their objectives or what they want to achieve to business objectives. But what you're talking about is fundamentally what you're doing is embedding itself. So the business objectives are effectively the HR objectives. I really love that. I want to just come back to what you said about the hybrid role thing, though. I, being a marketing person, am fascinated with telling stories and obviously communication. And so I wanted to get your kind of thoughts on learnings that you've had over time because it sounds to me like you're quite adaptable and agile in terms of how you tell the stories to the different types of units or your peers, whether it's marketing people, finance people, the CEO. So can I just get you to reflect a little bit on how or any advice you've got to anybody listening in who is either an existing CPO or a prospective CPO about how you deal with the different ways in which you communicate to different types of functions? The stereotypical thing in my head is, well, finance people dealing numbers and data, and technology people will deal in the analytics side. But like, how have you experienced it, and any sort of learnings you can give to anybody listening in?
I think for me, where I first found how to adapt to an audience was just by being culturally aware. So forget the area of business that they work in to start with, just anybody, in general life, to communicate on any kind of decent level and to really meaningfully connect, you have to have a bit of cultural awareness and you have to know your audience and your environment. And I think I was lucky in that I've grown up in a very global environment. I was transatlantic from a teenager. I had exposure in Asia, all over Europe. My family have French and Polish heritage, United States. So there's a big mix in there. And crucially, having conversations with different demographics and different cultures helps you understand or know what's important to them or know how to approach a subject. How I would give someone an instruction in Hong Kong versus how I give someone an instruction to my team in New York is absolutely worlds apart and very different. If I delivered the same message in Hong Kong as I delivered it in New York, I'd probably be fired because it's a very different way of communicating. And both are just as effective, but in their own cultural environments. I could not communicate how I do in Asia and New York. I wouldn't get anything done and nothing would pick up. So I think then if you translate that to then thinking about people working in different areas and specialisms, how do you then translate your message? Well, again, it's just about knowing their environment. It's about understanding, not being a specialist, by the way, but just understanding what their department does, what their function is, what their objectives are, and then having that initial relationship, personal relationship, and then knowing a bit of the other elements that I've just spoken about, you can then build a very conducive relationship to where, importantly as well, you're able to challenge. You can't go into a room and challenge if you don't know the basics of where they're coming from. I can go into a room and challenge on anything from my perspective, but I'm not going to be able to win an argument. And by the way, it's not always important that I win the argument, but it's important that you know that you've given a good shot and you've considered everything, because your point of view may have been the right one, but if you can't argue it correctly because you don't understand the audience that you're talking to, you're not going to land it. It's not going to win.
And is there, I'm thinking broadly, so I'm not specifically talking about in your current organizations, but around a C-suite table, are there relationships there that are easier or harder to connect with? And is there a different way of, communicating with some of those roles? And again, I reiterate, not asking you to talk about a very
I've got a very big smile at that question.
Just a very generic kind of C-suite table. Are there any kind of nuances in that?
Always. And you know what? It depends. I saw a house, and I'll mention names because I'm a huge fan and remain very loyal to them. So a house was founder-led by Nick Jones. He'd grown it from one business to huge 8,000 employees, operating in 9 different territories, etc. So he was amazing. How he operates in a board exec room is very different to, say, how my CEO from Sodexo would have delivered. I found Nick more innovative, got things done more quickly, had a great way of approaching everybody around the table and including everybody and being creative. He came from a very creative angle. So the reason why I mention that is because then on the flip side, you can have other people that are come up through quite a structured corporate entity. So again, it's about just knowing your audience and knowing how to approach them based on what's their preferred style, how they come up through their careers and their career trajectory, because you cannot guide Nick to fall into the traditional pattern of delivering a meeting, say, in a very corporate structured way, but nor would you want to, and nor would it have the impact or the outcome that you want. So I think I definitely have different relationships for those kind of reasons, but then I also have different relationships because I'm naturally drawn to someone through something outside of the more corporate environment that we're in. It might be that we just have similar interests, we have similar ways of thinking, and sometimes you've got to be really conscious about that, because you don't want to always default to that person and have them as your kind of validation, because then you're not being challenged yourself in the right way, and it can become a monopoly. So I'm always very clear, and I always have very transparent relationships to where I'll have stronger connections to some people more than others, but I'm still not afraid to challenge that person that I've got the strong connection with if I disagree with it. And I can disagree with empathy and with compassion and constructively, and we can still be friends outside of it. And in fact, I'm probably more likely to challenge them in a more robust way than I would someone who probably I don't have a strong relationship with.
And I wonder then, again, talking more generically, but what that means in terms, so we have a standard question on these podcasts. What does a CEO want from a CPO? Is there a standard answer to a standard question, or is it another, it depends perspective?
If I think what I would want from my CEO, it's the ability to soundboard. I understand I often report into the CEO. So you would naturally think because of that reporting line that there's an assumption that it's a kind of directional relationship versus a two-way. And I think the best relationships that I have is where I've been able to soundboard. So I might get the direction, but they're also looking for soundboarding. And they're going, okay, so this is what I want to do, blah, blah, blah. What's your thoughts? What's your ideas? Yeah. And then be open to challenge and be open to that conversation. But then on the flip side, knowing when to have the courage of their own conviction and go, okay, I heard you, but this is what I'm going with. And I have no ego whatsoever. I'll give my opinion in a room full of people. Everyone can disagree with me. That's fine. We all walk out and we deliver whatever. I think that's important that they have the courage of their own conviction too, because otherwise you won't leave that room and no one knows what you're doing.
Yeah, we've talked before about the role of the CPO as a critical friend to the CEO or to the C-suite more broadly. And that need to provide that challenge or that sounding board exactly as you described. And some of the, we have a paper on it, but some of the skills and capabilities that are needed for the CPO to be able to have that rational, exactly to your point, conversation that you can walk away from and still be friends and work brilliantly together and do what needs to be done outside of the room. But that not being the yes person or the person who says, okay, it's not how I do it. Here's the legal story about what will and won't work and all the employment law or employee relations challenges, but actually to stand up and say, as a business, this is why it's a challenging proposal, or again, back to this enterprise kind of leadership.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been very lucky with the CEOs who act exactly like that. So I guess my answer is pretty much based on my experience as well. Andrew Carney, Soho House, he's another great CEO that you could absolutely challenge and have quite fruitful conversations about a very pressing, important subject. And everyone's giving their clear challenges, concerns, and then we all come to a collective. And then sometimes he'll walk out and say, no, I hear you, but this is the right decision. And sometimes you can't explain why it's the right decision. Sometimes it just has to be the right decision. And you can't quite quantify it. You just got to trust and believe in that. And then you've all got to leave that room completely aligned. And I think that's where it's critical.
Yeah, and that C-suite alignment and having the confidence in each other on certain decisions and actually trusting who the experts are. And I think we talk about this internally. It's trusting the experts on what they're doing, but also sometimes you do need to make a decision that perhaps goes against the grain. As long as everyone is on the same boat and is in the same viewpoint that we're all doing this for the right reasons and we're all aiming in the right direction, then that's the important thing. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I haven't asked half of the questions. We did warn you beforehand, Keniro, that we'd have a load of questions and we wouldn't ask half of them. I wanted to talk about what you guys are doing in AI. Maybe this is another podcast that we'll get you in for part 2. We've talked a little bit about the commercial parts of the role, the relationship between the C-suite, which is really good. I really liked the conversation that we had around that comms piece and how that sort of changes depending on who your audience is and leading with empathy within that. My kind of final question, and then Debbie, if you want to do a final one just before we clock off today, is just around, so we've talked about your background and your viewpoints of what a CPO is, where your business is in the moment or your experiences. What does it look like? Let's do a little bit of crystal ball gazing. So the future role of a CPO. So if we're having a conversation, and I know it's a difficult one because no two roles are created the same depending on the business for the CPO. That's the reason why we created this kind of spin-off series. But what do you think changes within the next few years, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years for the role of the CPO? Is there anything that you can think of that I think that will definitely evolve, or maybe even there's certain bits that will remain consistent?
I think where I've just seen more expectation as a CPO is definitely in leader and transformation. So I know change transformation sits with us anyways to a certain extent, but it's being that change manager across all areas. So I'm not just talking from an internal perspective, governance, labor laws, commercial law, corporate law, torts, everything. You're expected to know the difference between all of it and then sit there and go, yeah, don't worry, we're covered. I thought about all of those elements, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the governance. It's very rare that they want us to go out and spend money and get that legal advice and get it signed off because it's expensive. And there's a lot of expectation to have almost be coming from that position of where you're 99% sure, and then you get it signed off by a lawyer to save the money. You're not bringing them in too early. And I think for me, that's where I've started to see more and more of a shift. That I think the triple threat of having people, commercial and client constantly in your framework when you're delivering as a CPO has been there for a long time and is starting to add that focus on the commercial element a bit more. But I think the extended part now seems to be where you think of all those complexities in terms of the legal external factors that you're expected to have a good grounding and insight or knowledge of. I think that's probably something that's evolving a bit more. And I know you have in-house counsels and things like that. Even all the big corporates I've worked at, we've had in-house counsel and they're great. You don't go and ask them. You're expected to know in the room. They're not in the room with you at that meeting.
Yeah, it's the proliferation of information that people have, and they immediately think that just because you have so much information at your fingertips, particularly with the advance of AI, that you're immediately meant to retain all of that and be able to recall all of that, which I think is quite fascinating. Debbie, we're pretty much out of time. Is there any kind of final sort of thoughts that you want, something you want to pose to Keniro before we drop off?
Yeah, just one final kind of nugget type question is, what's your critical success factor, do you think, that you would advise other CPOs to really focus on? What makes you as a successful CPO working in a successful business? What's the nugget?
I think it's not really due to a technical expertise that I could say. I think the only reason why I've progressed is because I've moved, which can sound counterintuitive, but because I've got exposure where I wouldn't have gotten before, and because I've never said no. So I've always gone in going, I can do it and I'll figure it out. And I think that's the only way. It's like when I first moved to the States professionally to work, I had no idea of US legislation. I didn't even know what FLSA was in California, or wage an hour. I was like, I'll do it. And you figure it out. And I think, obviously, without putting the company at risk, don't say you know everything and then do something catastrophic. But it's purely that, not being afraid to move and not being afraid to say no. I think that's it.
I really like that ending, not being afraid to say, well, saying yes all the time. One of my former colleagues years ago used to have this phrase, which was, we can do it. We can do the impossible. It just takes a little longer sometimes. So I quite like that. So listen, Keniro, amazing to have you on. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been very informative. And I've really loved some of the conversation pieces we've had, particularly around that innovation of the year stuff and the linking what you're doing to the physical way in which the organization is being run. So thank you very much for taking some time with us today.
Brilliant. No, I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great conversation. Very short. It feels like it's flown by. So it's been great.
They always do. They always do, particularly when you start digging in at stuff. Debbie, thank you very much as my co-host, as always.
Thank you very much. Great conversation. Thanks, Keniro. It's
been brilliant. Hopefully you've enjoyed this as much as the three of us have enjoyed recording it. And if you would like to follow us, if you'd like to suggest some themes, well, this, as I said, is a spin-off series, but we cover absolutely everything, anything to do with the people function on the People Agenda podcasts. Other than that, I think there's nothing more from me left to say other than from myself, from Keniro and from Debbie. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the People Agenda. Bye-bye.